Hi there, Miss Baxter here. I'm going to talk to you about my project that I made for If I Were Alive in 1835. Here it is. I'll talk more about it in detail in a little while. And yes, I know that his face in the middle of the poster is really weird looking, and that's part of the design. So, If I Were Alive has three parts. It has this part, step one, where you choose a topic and you learn about it. It has part two, step two, which is thinking about what you've learned. And it has step three, which is making something to demonstrate to show what you've learned. Now, all of this is on display on the whiteboard on the side of my classroom. You're welcome to come in and look at all of it in detail. I'm going to go over it for you in case you're not one of my students. You just watch this video. Okay, so first I picked a topic. So I chose the topic of William Clark. Clark is the guy in the picture on the right. He's one of Lewis and Clark. He's the Clark part of Lewis and Clark. And I've always been a fan of Lewis and Clark. I think it's a real interesting story in American history. And I realized when I was thinking about it that I could, if I were alive in 1835 and if I were in St. Louis, I'd actually maybe have a chance of meeting William Clark, which would be cool. So I went looking, and on Google Books I found a chapter in a book called William Clark, Indian Diplomat. This is the cover of the book. And I just was able to summon up a chapter called The Fur Trade, Indian Removal, and the Black Hawk War, which is from basically our era. And I thought about reading it digitally, but I didn't. I used the snipping tool to copy and paste the entire chapter onto a Word document. I printed it out, and I read it and annotated it on paper like this. So one thing that was really awful was that I ran out of real paper and had to use heavy duty paper, and so my chapter has some big paper that's heavy and some flimsy paper, and my OCD was really bugging me, but I powered through. Here is the author of that book. His name is Jay Buckley, and he's currently a professor of history at Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City. I kind of stalked him a little bit to find that out. So I was reading, and I was reading from about 8:15 until 7:35 to 8:15, and my daughter wanted me to play a game with her. So I stopped reading, we played a game, and then we started playing Scrabble. So Scrabble, you know, you have time between turns, so I read between turns for the rest of the chapter. When I was looking at this, when I was looking over the whole thing, I realized how much prior knowledge I brought to this topic, because I've read about Lewis and Clark, I've read about George Rogers Clark, William Clark's brother, I've read a whole series of historical fiction books by Larry McMurtry about this exact time in this exact place with some of these exact people in it. And I actually went to St. Louis this summer, but I'm going to go back, maybe spring break. So I read and I annotated the article. That was step one. You can come and look at it. Okay, so step two is the part that we're having the most trouble with. It's called thinking about what you've learned. And this is the part where you're supposed to use Kaplan's matrix for depth and complexity, or Bloom's taxonomy for higher level thinking skills. And when I was reviewing my notes, I realized that what I really needed to do was do an analysis, a comparison and contrast, because Clark felt like he was working on behalf of the Indians, but a lot of the times what he was doing was benefiting the whites the most. So this took about 40 minutes going over my notes. So this seems pretty straightforward, pretty simple to make a T-chart. But I want you to notice that each one of my items on the T-chart is detailed, and it's more than just a couple. Some of them are just a couple of words. That says Mountain Man Info. And underneath it, it says wanted to ban alcohol, banned alcohol in 1832. When I was going through my annotations, I went through my margin notes, and I saw what was in the margins, and I saw which ones of these I could put on the left side where he was doing things that was benefiting the Indians, and which I could put on the right side when he was doing things that would benefit the whites. So you'll see that that's not a simple T-chart. It's got quite a few items on it. I've formed a thesis. So you may not be able to read cursive, especially my cursive, but here is what it says. William Clark was the most prominent white man who understood Indians' issues best, and even he was unable to shift the course of Indian genocide. That was my first thesis. So I had read and learned. I had used the higher level thinking skill of analysis, and then I was thinking about what I should make to show what I had learned and thought about. So my first go-to trick is always to write something because I'm a good writer. And it's easy for me, and it pleases me. And I even had a character named Izzy Stone that was going to be a reporter that was going to interview William Clark. But I decided not to do that. And then I thought, why doesn't somebody make a movie about William Clark? It's very interesting. But I decided not to do that because I thought about collage. And I thought about how if I had a collage, I could show the difference between the Clark that was helpful to the Indians and the Clark that was helpful to the whites. So I combined mural and collage. I revised my thesis. It now says, William Clark was the most prominent white man who understood Native culture and the needs and wants of the tribes, but even he was unable to alter the course of the relentless westward pressure by whites. He was a man pulled in two directions. That explains his weird-looking face. I wanted to show that tension and that pulling apart. In the collage and the images on the left, this is Clark's earlier career as an explorer. He went to work as an Indian commissioner in the 1810s. It was actually 1813 through 1838. In that time period, white westward movement became more intense, and the pressure became more intense, and the violence and the conflicts became more intense. So there was a lot about Clark that I didn't know, like I didn't know that he had brokered all these treaties with the Indians. And when I say that, what I mean is the removal of the Indians from their tribes. Now, I'm not talking about southeastern removal. I'm talking about the part in the Northwest Territory. Moving the Sac and Fox, moving the tribes into Missouri and into Oklahoma. The removal of the Sac and Fox ended up in the Black Hawk War. And it was kind of a disaster. It all resolved itself pretty well. Clark first, he lost his patience and he said a war of extermination should be waged against them, and he meant it. But later on, when they were in jail, he argued that they shouldn't be hanged. They should be released and restored to their tribes. So my final product, I wanted to show sort of William Clark as a man pulled in two directions. Even doing his best, he was unable to sort of stop something that would be so harmful to the Indians. All right. Finding the images for this took me about an hour. Coloring the page behind the images took me about 15 minutes. I didn't have any pastels. I had to buy some. I bought some printer paper while I was at it. Cutting and gluing the images took me about half an hour. I colored behind the images just because I had sort of a color scheme in mind. I also revised my thesis. When I printed out my thesis, it was too long. I had to tape this extra material to the bottom of my poster. So, things didn't all just go swimmingly. There were complications. But like I said, I powered through. Would I get an A? Well, yes, I would get an A because I read and I annotated the article. I acquired new knowledge. I processed the new knowledge using higher level thinking skills. I formed a good thesis. I created a product that reflected my new knowledge and my thesis. And I learned stuff, which is more important than getting a good grade. I learned stuff. I learned about Clark. I always admired him. I didn't really know that he was this instrumental in Indian removal. I knew the Indians got to the Indian Territory in some way. I knew the story about the southeastern Indians, but I didn't really know about the ones that were in the Old Northwest Territory. That was Clark. So I really felt like a little dismay about him, and I felt a little bit of sympathy for him, and then I realized I'm probably going to have to read that whole book. So this is my example of If I Were Alive. And I think it's an example that if you're wondering how to do this project better, and we all probably need to wonder about that, we all need to do the project a little bit better. Go back to this video, watch it again, ask for help, and do your best work.